In the spring of 1721, a clerk employed by the naval officer of the James River in colonial Virginia took up his quill and entered into his ledger a run of vessels whose human cargoes had been embarked not on the Gold Coast, or in Senegambia, or in Angola, but in the creeks and rivers of the Bight of Biafra, the great curve of coastline that today fronts southeastern Nigeria and western Cameroon. And for page after page that year, more than 3/4 of the Africans whose coastal origins he bothered to record are listed as having been purchased in that single region, with the word that follows their port of embarkation written again and again in the clerk's hurried hand as Abo, the contemporary English rendering of what we now call Igbo. That one archival pattern, repeated across thousands of similar entries made between the collapse of the Royal African Company's monopoly in 1698 and the outbreak of the American Revolution, is not a curiosity or an isolated year. It is the statistical signature of a profound demographic fact that has remained largely invisible in the popular telling of American history, which is that in the tidewater Chesapeake, in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, that would provide the demographic core for much of Black America, a very specific African people, the Igbo of the forested hinterland behind the ports of Old Calabar and Bonny, were not a small scattered minority, but during the formative decades of the 18th century, the single largest African group, arriving in such numbers and at such a concentrated moment that their language and their farming knowledge and their music and their understandings of power and resistance were woven into the very foundation of the African-American culture that was being made under slavery on the tobacco plantations of the Tidewater, a foundation whose descendants are still present today, often without having been given the precise name for the ancestry they carry. To understand how that concentration came to be, we have to follow the mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade as it actually operated in the early 18th century, rather than as it is often imagined as a single undifferentiated flow. The Bight of Biafra was, for British traders in particular, an exceptionally active and exceptionally open frontier. Unlike the Gold Coast, where European forts had for centuries regulated trade through a small number of fortified castles, the rivers of the Bight of Biafra were a decentralized network of trading towns and landing places. At the mouth of the Cross River lay Old Calabar, dominated by Efik merchant houses. At the mouth of the Imo River lay Bonny, dominated by Ijaw and later Ibani merchant houses, and behind them stretched a vast interior commercial system that linked the coast to the Igbo heartland through a lattice of markets, riverine transport along the Niger and its tributaries, and institutions that could convert debt and judicial penalty and pawnship into enslavement, a system that, as European demand for labor intensified in the Americas, was increasingly supplemented by organized kidnapping and by the violence organized around the powerful oracular center at Arachukwu, whose network of priests and warriors extended deep into Igbo land. Igbo land itself was not a kingdom with a single king whose edicts could open or close trade. It was a dense mosaic of village republics, autonomous communities of several hundred to several thousand people, linked by a common language with significant dialect variation, by a shared religious cosmology centered on Allah, the earth deity who governed morality and fertility, and by an economy in which the cultivation of the white yam, Dioscorea rotundata, was both subsistence and a complete system of value, a crop that required the building of large mounds, the careful staking of vines, the curing and storage of tubers in barns, and whose harvest was marked by ritual observances that articulated a man's standing and a community's relationship to the land. That political decentralization mattered enormously for the trade, because it meant that there was no centralized authority to negotiate a treaty or to mount a coordinated military resistance to European demand. And after 1698, when the English Parliament opened the African trade to private merchants out of ports like Bristol and Liverpool, those merchants found that they could assemble a full cargo on the Bight of Biafra with remarkable speed, buying 10 or 20 captives at a time from many different inland villages, assembling a hold that was diverse in village origin but strikingly homogeneous in language and culture, and then making the middle passage to the Chesapeake in a matter of weeks. The numbers that emerge when historians reconstruct that trade from the surviving evidence are both precise and sobering. The transatlantic slave trade database, built from shipping records in British, Portuguese, French, and Dutch archives, together with the extraordinarily detailed Naval Office shipping lists that survive for Virginia and the port books that record arrivals in Bristol and Liverpool, allow us to estimate that between roughly 1698 and 1775, the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland imported directly from Africa on the order of 120,000 to 140,000 enslaved people, a figure that does not include the additional thousands who were brought overland from other mainland colonies after landing elsewhere. Within that total, the share that came from the Bight of Biafra in the early period is disproportionate to that region's share of the overall transatlantic trade. In the decades before about 1740, and most intensively between 1700 and 1740, historians who have worked most closely with the Virginia records find that between 30 and 45% of Africans disembarked in Virginia had been embarked in the Bight of Biafra. And because the commerce of Old Calabar and Bonny during exactly that era drew overwhelmingly on the Igbo interior, the great majority of those Biafran captives, in many age and sex samples between 80 and 90%, were described by contemporary traders and by Virginia planters as Abo or Igbo. In absolute terms, that represents tens of thousands of people. On conservative estimates, at least 35 to 45,000 Igbo men, women and children landed on the wharves at Yorktown and at Urbana and at Annapolis, and then marched in coffles to the tobacco fields of the Tidewater, not as isolated individuals who would be unable to speak to one another, but as shipmates and countryfolk who could understand each other's speech, who recognized the facial scarification known as ichi and the body marks that indicated village affiliation, who knew the same proverbs, the same stories about the tortoise and the leopard, the same foodways built around yam fufu and bitter leaf soup, the same calendar of market weeks and the same ways of mourning and burying the dead, and who arrived at precisely the moment when the enslaved population of the Chesapeake was undergoing a fundamental transformation from a small, relatively creolized community that still included many people of mixed African and European ancestry, and even some European indentured laborers, to a large, rapidly growing and overwhelmingly African-born population that would, after about 1730, begin to reproduce naturally and become the self-sustaining demographic core of African America in the Upper South. That timing is why the historian Douglas B. Chambers, who is based at the University of Southern Mississippi and whose work on the Virginia shipping records and Virginia Gazette runaway advertisements has done more than any other scholarship to bring this pattern to light, has used the phrase the Igboization of the Tidewater Chesapeake, a term that is deliberately provocative but that he uses in a precise and bounded scholarly sense. Chambers does not mean that Virginia became culturally Igbo in the sense that the English colonists adopted Igbo political institutions, nor does he mean that other African peoples were absent, because they were not, with significant numbers of Akan speakers from the Gold Coast, Gola and other peoples from the Windward Coast, and later very large numbers of people from Angola carried to South Carolina and Georgia in the mid-18th century. What he means is that because the Igbo arrived so early and in such relative concentration during the period when the fundamental patterns of African American culture in the Chesapeake were being established, patterns of child naming and kinship reckoning, patterns of farming on provision grounds, patterns of music and dance at night and on holidays, patterns of speech that would eventually feed into African American English, their imprint was larger than their already large numbers alone would suggest, an imprint that later arrivals from other parts of Africa would add to and complicate but would never entirely erase. It is why, in the runaway advertisements that Chesapeake masters placed in newspapers like the Virginia Gazette from the 1730s through the 1750s, the ethnonym Igbo appears with such striking regularity alongside the English names that enslavers had imposed, alongside descriptions of stature and clothing and skills, alongside notes about whether the person spoke good English or newly arrived English, and it is why the planters themselves developed a collective and racialized folklore about what an Igbo person was like, a folklore repeated in their letters and in their plantation instruction manuals that tells us more about planter anxiety than about Igbo character, but that nevertheless testifies to how numerous and how visible that community remained in the eyes of those who claimed to own them. And here we must pause with deliberate care and be entirely explicit about the limits of what history can claim with certainty, because the very power of the Igbo presence in the Chesapeake has sometimes been communicated through a single widely quoted figure that deserves to be handled not as a settled census, but as what it actually is, an informed scholarly estimate that remains part of an ongoing academic conversation. Douglas Chambers has estimated that as many as 60% of Black Americans alive today might have at least one Igbo ancestor. That estimate has circulated widely in documentary films, in press coverage, and on social media, often presented as a definitive factoid, and it is easy to understand why it has captured public imagination, because it offers a direct and intimate connection between tens of millions of people living today and a specific people in southeastern Nigeria. Chambers bases that projection on a demographic model that links several well-documented observations: the high proportion of Igbo arrivals in the Chesapeake during the formative period before 1740, the fact that the Chesapeake enslaved population experienced earlier and more sustained natural increase than the enslaved populations of the Low Country or the Caribbean, and therefore contributed disproportionately to the ancestry of later generations through forced internal migration to the Cotton South in the 19th century, and the mathematics of genealogical diffusion over 10 to 12 generations, in which even a relatively concentrated ancestral cohort can become widely distributed across descendant pedigrees. But Chambers himself presents that figure as an estimate, an extrapolation that depends on assumptions about family structure and migration and reproduction under slavery, not as a count derived from complete individual genealogies, because no such complete genealogies exist for the vast majority of enslaved families. Other historians of the slave trade, most notably David Eltis, who has been one of the principal architects of the transatlantic slave trade database and who has worked with the same shipping data at a continental scale, have offered more cautious interpretations when the picture is extended from Virginia and Maryland to the mainland North American colonies as a whole, noting that when the very large and later flows into South Carolina and Georgia from the Bight of Benin, from West Central Africa, and from Senegambia are taken into account, the overall share of the transatlantic trade to what became the United States that originated in the Bight of Biafra is smaller than its share in the Chesapeake alone during the peak decades, and that any attempt to translate shipping shares into contemporary ancestry percentages must contend with the complex realities of intermarriage across regional African origins over centuries. The deeper and more structural problem, and this is something every serious historian of slavery will emphasize, is that the archive itself was designed to erase the very identities we are now trying to recover. African personal names were systematically stripped at the point of sale and replaced with English Christian names that were often reused across many individuals. Ages were guessed rather than recorded. Ethnic designations like Igbo or Coromantee or Angola were applied by European traders and American buyers using inconsistent criteria, sometimes indicating the African port of embarkation, sometimes indicating the coastal middleman's label, sometimes indicating the buyer's folk taxonomy rather than the person's own self-identification, and families were deliberately separated by sale, with children removed from parents and spouses from one another, which means that the paper trail that survives for most enslaved families, when it survives at all, breaks off within 1 or 2 generations after arrival and cannot be followed as a continuous lineage back to a specific village. We cannot, for any given African American family today, without an exceptionally rare and unbroken chain of documentation and oral history preserved through freedom, point to a single ledger line from 1727 and say with genealogical certainty that this is your great-grandmother 8 times over. What we can say, and what the scholarship supports with appropriate caution, is that at the level of population history, the Igbo contribution to the ancestry of a very large fraction of Black Americans is likely to be substantial, that the demographic conditions for widespread Igbo ancestry clearly existed, while also acknowledging that any single number, whether it is 60% or a lower figure, remains debated among historians and should be understood as a reasoned hypothesis to be weighed rather than a final census to be memorized. That honesty does not diminish the significance of the history. It is what makes the history credible, because it respects both the remarkable power of the surviving shipping and newspaper evidence and the violence of an archival system that was built to make people forgettable. If we accept that population-level frame with its necessary cautions, then the more intimate and human question becomes what that presence actually sounded and tasted and looked like in the daily lives of people who were trying, under conditions of extreme coercion and surveillance, to preserve something of who they had been while building something new that had never existed before. The traces are not speculative. They are documented in language and in tools and in the frustrated complaints of the very men who claim to own them, and they accumulate into a consistent picture. The most familiar and concrete example is a word that every American who cooks knows, the word okra, the name for the green pods whose mucilage thickens soups and stews, and that is central to the cooking of the South and indispensable to the cuisine of the Gullah Geechee Lowcountry. That word enters written English in the early 18th century in the context of Virginia and Carolina, and its etymology is directly traceable to the Igbo language, where the plant is known as okuru or okwuru, or a close dialect variant, a term that crossed the Atlantic not as an abstract loanword, but together with the seeds themselves, which enslaved women carried with them in the braids of their hair or in small pouches, and together with an entire body of knowledge about how to plant it in the bottomlands that resembled in heat and humidity the forest gardens that had been left behind, how to tend it through the summer, and how to cook it so that its properties were best used to thicken soups that otherwise resembled the soups of home. That single word is therefore a living botanical archive of forced migration, a piece of southeastern Nigeria growing in American soil and persisting in American speech. A second and even more revealing example concerns the fate of the most important food crop in Igbo land, the white yam. In the Igbo villages from which so many of the Chesapeake captives were taken, the white yam was far more than calories. It was the central pillar of agriculture and of masculine prestige and of ritual exchange. The crop whose mounds a young man built to demonstrate his readiness for marriage, whose barns full of tubers measured a wealthy man's fortune, whose planting and harvest were governed by careful agronomic knowledge about soil and staking and curing, and whose successful storage through the dry season required architectural skill in building yam barns that allowed air to circulate while keeping tubers dry. Virginia's temperate climate and its short growing season could not support the true tropical yam at the scale that tobacco required, and planters who were interested above all in a commodity that could be sold in London had little incentive to try to replicate West African yam agriculture for the people they enslaved. What enslaved Igbo farmers did, as documented in plantation provision accounts and in later agricultural descriptions and in the recollections of formerly enslaved people recorded long after emancipation, was to transfer that entire complex of skill and meaning onto the crop that would grow in tidewater soils and that could fill a similar dietary and cultural niche. The sweet potato, Ipamoea batatas, a New World crop that is botanically unrelated to the true yam, but that is still called a yam in much of African American English today. A linguistic substitution that preserves the memory of the earlier crop in the very act of renaming. In the provision grounds, the small patches that many Virginia plantations allowed enslaved people to cultivate for themselves on Sundays and on holidays, and even along the edges of the tobacco fields themselves, enslaved people built the same kinds of ridges and mounds that yams had required. They managed vines with the same techniques of staking and pruning, and they produced a staple that could be dried and stored, and that provided both sustenance and a measure of autonomy, because what was grown in the provision ground could be eaten or exchanged according to the community's own decisions. The substitution was therefore not simply a matter of finding something to eat. It was an act of cultural preservation through adaptation, a way of keeping the structure of a food system alive when its central ingredient was denied by climate and by slavery. The musical trace is equally material. Among the instruments described by 18th century observers of enslaved life in Virginia and Maryland, alongside the better-known early forms of the banjo, whose ancestry lies among Manda-speaking peoples further west in Africa, is a small single-headed drum of a type that organologists and historians have linked to the Igbo-speaking region, often recorded in inventories and in passing descriptions under the name Igbo drum. It was a hand drum, relatively narrow in diameter, designed to be held under the arm or between the knees and played with a single stick or with the hands, producing a sharp and penetrating tone that could carry across a quarter at night. References to it appear in descriptions of evening gatherings, of Saturday night dances, and of covert religious observances held away from the overseer's gaze, where music and movement created a temporary space of autonomy and of remembrance. That drum, together with rattles and with call and response singing, is part of the material evidence for an African-derived sound world that existed alongside and within the imposed world of Anglican psalmody and Anglo-American fiddle music, not as a relic that would quickly disappear, but as a continuous practice that would be transmitted to children born in Virginia who had never seen Nigeria. And then there is the archive of planter stereotype that must be read with both caution and attention, because it reveals as much about the anxieties of the enslavers as it does about the strategies of the enslaved. In letter after letter, masters and overseers warned one another that Igbo slaves were melancholy, that they were prone to what the planters called suicide, that they were obstinate and insolent, that they were rebellious and required strict and constant watching. On its face, this is planter racism, a way of pathologizing the response to captivity and of blaming the victims of the trade for their own suffering. Read against the grain, however, those very complaints become evidence of a cultural stance that planters found unusually difficult to break. Igbo village society, with its emphasis on segmentary organization, on governance by councils of elders and by age grades, on the authority of earth priests, and on the oracular consultation at shrines, had not socialized its members to accept the absolute and arbitrary authority of a single master who claimed ownership of their bodies. The very reputation for melancholy that planters linked to a supposed tendency toward self-destruction points to the devastating psychological reality of people who understood exile not only as physical removal, but as a spiritual catastrophe, a rupture in the relationship between the living, the ancestors, and the earth that could not be repaired in Virginia, and who in some cases chose to end their own lives rather than live under permanent enslavement, a choice that planters could only interpret as stubbornness or morbidity, rather than as a final assertion of autonomy over their own persons. It is in that context that we must also understand the significance of the name itself, because in Virginia, the word Igbo did not simply designate a shipping origin, it became a social category that enslaved people themselves could recognize and mobilize as a basis for solidarity, a way for people from different villages who shared a language to find one another, to intermarry, to form networks of support that would be consequential for generations. No single event brings together that reputation, that cultural memory, and that historical tragedy more powerfully than what happened in May of 1803 at a place that is now known as Igbo Landing, although on contemporary maps it was simply a tidal bend of Dunbar Creek on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, an island that was then being transformed into a landscape of sea island cotton plantations worked by hundreds of enslaved laborers. To tell this story accurately, we must be as precise as the sources allow and as humble as the gaps in those sources require. In the spring of that year, a coastal vessel, most commonly identified in the later accounts as the schooner York, although some records render the name as Morovia or refer to it simply as a coastwise slaver, arrived on the Georgia coast carrying a cargo of captive Africans who had been purchased in the Bight of Biafra and who were identified in the surviving 19th century recollections as Igbo. They had been bought at a price on the coast and were being transported to be resold on the island by two slave traders operating in the region, John Cooper and Thomas Spaulding. What happened next is not preserved in a detailed contemporary naval report filed the next morning, or in a court deposition taken under oath from surviving participants, but in a set of overlapping accounts written down decades later by white observers who had heard the story as local law, and, far more importantly, in the continuous oral tradition of the Gullah Geechee people, the descendants of enslaved Africans who built a distinctive and enduring culture along the coasts and sea islands of Georgia and South Carolina, and who, because of the relative isolation of the islands, the prevalence of the task labor system, and the periodic importation of Africans into the Low Country, even after the legal closure of the transatlantic trade in 1808, retained more direct African linguistic, craft, and ritual elements than almost any other African-American community in the United States. According to those traditions, the Igbo captives, once brought ashore, or while being brought from the vessel to the shore under the guard of their captors, rose in rebellion. The precise sequence differs between versions, as we should expect with an event transmitted orally for generations before it was ever written down. but the core elements are consistent, and they are the elements that have allowed the memory to endure. In some variants, the revolt began on the vessel itself, with the captives seizing control and forcing the small crew toward the shore. In other variants, it began immediately after landing, when the captives were being driven toward the plantation enclosure. In all variants, the confrontation resulted in the deaths of several of the white crew, who were drowned in the shallow water, and in the captives finding themselves on the marshy bank of Dunbar Creek, free for a moment, but surrounded by water and by the knowledge that pursuit would be immediate, and that recapture would mean the full violence of Georgia slavery. What they did next is what has made the site sacred. Rather than scatter into the dense maritime forest, where they might have been hunted down individually, the large group of Igbo captives, led according to many tellings by a high-status individual among them, a chief or a priest whose authority was recognized by the others, turned and walked together into the creek, entered the water, and in an act that has been described both as mass suicide and as collective martyrdom, drowned themselves. The number of people who died that day is not fixed in the written record with the kind of precision a modern incident investigation would provide, with estimates in later 19th and early 20th century accounts ranging from as few as 10 or 13 to more than 70, and with disagreement about whether the count includes those killed in the initial fight on the vessel or only those who entered the water together. That variation is not a reason to doubt that the event occurred. It is exactly what we should expect from an event whose primary archive for more than a century was oral, and whose secondary written accounts were produced by local white chroniclers writing long after emancipation, often with romantic or moralizing filters, and who sometimes conflated this episode with other instances of resistance on the Georgia coast. What is not in doubt is that the planters of Glynn County considered the deaths significant enough to be remembered by name, that the site itself acquired a durable toponym, Igbo Landing, also rendered in local usage as Igbo Landing or Igbo's Landing, that persisted in deed books and in local speech even when no white monument was erected, and that for more than 2 centuries the descendants of the enslaved people of St. Simon's Island have pointed to that bend in the creek and said, "This is where the Igbo people chose the water over the yoke. This is where our ancestors decided that freedom could still be claimed, even if the only way to claim it was to return to the spirit world on their own terms." In the early 20th century, when anthropologists and writers including Lydia Parrish and later the field workers of the Federal Writers Project came to the Sea Islands to record Gullah Geechee folklore, music and language, they found that the story had not only survived but had been transformed, as living traditions do when they carry great moral weight, into something even more powerful than a straightforward historical anecdote. It had become the myth of the flying Africans, perhaps the most widely known and most philosophically rich narrative in the African-American oral tradition. In the Gullah Geechee telling, which has been collected in multiple variants on St. Simon's and on neighboring Sapelo Island and throughout the Low Country, the Igbo did not simply drown, they rose. They walked on the water, they flew, they sprouted wings, and returned in a single collective motion across the ocean to Africa. In one of the most frequently recorded versions, an elder would say, the Igbo knew how to fly before they were brought over, but since they had been in chains, they had forgotten, or their wings had been clipped. And when they turned together at Dunbar Creek, the water gave them back their wings, and they lifted off the marsh and flew home, or that they turned into buzzards and rose into the air, a detail that links the story to West African beliefs about the relationship between humans and birds and about the ability of the spirit to travel. In another variant, the leader is said to have uttered a word or sung a song that restored the power of flight, and the whole company rose while the overseers watched, unable to stop them. It is essential to understand that this is not a misunderstanding of history or a naive embellishment to be corrected by reference to shipping manifests. It is the community's profound act of cultural interpretation, a way for people who had endured slavery and its aftermath to assert that those who died at Dunbar Creek had not been defeated or erased, but had exercised a final and transcendent form of resistance, that their spirits had refused captivity and had completed a journey on their own terms. The motif of flying Africans appears elsewhere in the African diaspora, with variants recorded in the Caribbean and in the American South, but its most continuous, best documented, and most place-anchored home is precisely in the Gullah Geechee corridor. tied to a specific bend in a specific creek and to a specific people remembered as Igbo, which is why the story has remained so durable. That the event is both historical and mythic at the same time is not a contradiction. It is what gives it its enduring power, and any honest telling must hold both registers together, acknowledging that the exact military details of May 1803, the name of the schooner, the precise hour of the tide, the precise number of souls lost, will probably never be fully recoverable in the way a modern historian trained on state archives might wish, while also insisting that the significance of the event does not depend on whether we can provide that level of forensic detail, because its significance lies in the fact that a community has remembered it without interruption for more than 200 years, has named the landscape after it, has woven it into the ethical instruction of children, and has drawn from it a language for talking about freedom that outlived slavery itself and that continues to be invoked whenever the choice between dignified death and dehumanized life is at stake. That the memory remains alive is visible not only in the small park and historical marker that now stand near Dunbar Creek, where libations are poured and where annual commemorations gather Gullah Geechee elders and young people to read names and to sing, but also in the way contemporary writers, filmmakers and musicians have returned to it as a touchstone for thinking about resistance and return. Briefly, and without making these works the proof of the history itself, we can note that the image of Africans who fly rather than submit recurs in the literature of Toni Morrison, in the visual language of more recent film and in song, where the motif of black people rising and taking flight is invoked as a deliberate shorthand for the much older Gullah Geechee story. Those modern invocations do not authenticate the 1803 event in the way an archival document might, and we should not treat a novel or a music video as a primary source for 18th century shipping, but they do demonstrate that the memory has traveled far beyond the marsh at Dunbar Creek and has entered a broader American cultural vocabulary, which is itself a form of historical continuity and a measure of the deep impression that the Igbo Landing story has left on the national imagination. From that marsh, we now move to the laboratory, because in the last 15 years, a new kind of archive has entered the conversation about Igbo ancestry, one that promises for many descendants a more personal and intimate link than shipping ledgers or newspaper advertisements ever could. But that also comes with specific technical limitations that must be explained with exactly the same clarity and honesty that we have tried to bring to the historical evidence. Commercial direct-to-consumer DNA testing, offered by companies such as 23 and Me and Ancestry DNA, and by several smaller firms, now allows millions of Americans to submit a saliva sample and receive an estimate of their biogeographic ancestry, often rendered as a set of colorful percentages linked to contemporary reference populations, such as Nigerian, Benin and Togo, or Cameroon, Congo and Western Bantu, together with a maternal haplogroup inherited through mitochondrial DNA that traces a single line of mothers back thousands of years, and, for those who carry a Y chromosome, a paternal haplogroup that traces a single line of fathers, and a list of predicted genetic cousins who share measurable segments of DNA identical by descent. For African Americans who have long been told that their ancestry is unknowable beyond the fact of slavery, these tests can be profoundly meaningful, emotionally as well as intellectually, and they have, in many families, provided the first genetic confirmation that a substantial portion of their ancestry does indeed trace to the region of southeastern Nigeria, a confirmation that can be placed alongside family oral history as a source of identity and pride. At the population level, the broad picture that has emerged from both the aggregated results of commercial databases and from peer-reviewed academic studies that have analyzed thousands of African American genomes aligns in general terms with what the historians have argued from paper, which is that the African ancestry of Black Americans is predominantly West and West Central African, with very substantial contributions from the Bight of Biafra and neighboring regions, but also with major contributions from the Bight of Benin, from West Central Africa broadly defined, from Senegambia, and from the Gold Coast, reflecting the full sweep of the transatlantic trade over more than 2 centuries and the forced internal movements that later mixed those regional origins together in the American South. What the tests cannot do, and this is where careful explanation matters more than marketing language, is to deliver a fixed, once-and-for-all percentage that says you are exactly, for example, 32% Igbo, in the sense that 32% of your great-great-grandparents were Igbo. The reason is not that the tests are fraudulent, or that the underlying science of reading DNA is unreliable, but that the ethnicity percentages themselves are estimates that depend entirely on a reference database. That is, a set of DNA samples taken from living people around the world today whose four-grandparents are believed to have come from a particular region, or who have long family histories in that region, and whose genomes are then used as a proxy for what the genetics of that region looked like in the past. When a company reports that you are, for example, 28% Nigerian, what the algorithm is actually saying, in statistical terms, is that about 28% of the segments of your genome most closely resemble the genomes of the people currently in its Nigerian reference panel, more than they resemble the genomes in any of its other panels, given the specific mathematical model it uses to assign segments and given the way it has decided to divide the continent into regions and to label those regions. That reference panel is not fixed in time. It is revised and expanded periodically as companies collect more samples, as they improve their algorithms, and as they make business decisions about how granular to make their categories and what to name them. As a result, a person who tested in 2018 and was told they were 28% Nigeria and 5% Benin and Togo might log back into the same account after a 2022 or 2023 or 2024 update and see that the same DNA, unchanged in their body, is now reported as 35% Nigerian, or as 15% Nigerian and 20% broadly West African, not because their ancestry has changed, but because the company's categories and the composition of its reference database have changed. This instability is especially pronounced for African ethnic breakdowns, and particularly for groups like the Igbo, for two interlocking reasons. First, the genetic diversity within Africa is immense, far greater than the diversity within Europe or within East Asia, which means that drawing clean statistical boundaries between neighboring peoples who have exchanged genes for millennia on the basis of small differences in allele frequencies is inherently challenging, and any classification will have broad confidence intervals. Second, African reference databases were historically smaller and less geographically granular than European databases, because sampling has been uneven and because colonial and post-colonial history has meant that fewer African communities were included in early large-scale biobank projects. And although the databases have grown considerably, they still reflect that history of unequal sampling, which makes assignment to a single modern ethnic label, such as Igbo, rather than a broader regional label, such as Southeastern Nigerian, or broadly West African, more uncertain than, for example, distinguishing Irish from English ancestry in a European test. The companies themselves acknowledge this in their technical white papers, where they report confidence intervals and where they often provide a broadly defined category alongside the more specific one precisely to communicate that uncertainty. But that nuance is frequently lost when results are shared as screenshots on social media. A second point of honesty concerns the broader genomic structure of the African American population, as it is understood from peer-reviewed research rather than from any single commercial report, because those peer-reviewed studies use larger sample sizes and more explicit statistical models, and are therefore a better guide to the population as a whole. Studies that have analyzed autosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and Y chromosome data for thousands of African American participants in different regions of the country have consistently found that on average, African Americans carry roughly 70 to 75% African ancestry, roughly 20 to 24% European ancestry, and typically a very small proportion of Native American ancestry that on average is on the order of 1% or less, although these averages mask an enormous range of individual variation that is the most important fact to communicate. In those same studies, some individuals have well over 90% African ancestry. Others have less than 50%. Some have no detectable Native American ancestry at all, while others have several percent. And the average European component tends to vary by region and by family history, with people whose families have roots in the Low Country often showing slightly different patterns than those whose families trace to the Upper South, reflecting different histories of admixture and of internal migration during slavery and after emancipation. That European admixture, which for the most part reflects coercive sexual exploitation under slavery and later structural inequalities, is itself an integral part of the genetic history and should not be treated as a footnote or as something to be explained away. And it is one reason why DNA alone, while powerful, can never stand in for the full historical narrative of family and community, which includes kinship formed through care as well as through biology. Finally, we must address one more thread that often arises whenever the Igbo and questions of deep origin are discussed in public forums and online communities, because to omit it would be to leave a significant part of the cultural record unexplained, and to misrepresent it would be to do a disservice both to history and to science. Within a portion of Igbo cultural and religious life, particularly as it has developed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there exists a deeply held and sincerely maintained tradition that the Igbo are descended from one of the ancient Israelite tribes, most commonly traced through the figures of Eri and Gad, who are described in some Igbo oral genealogies and by some contemporary religious leaders as having migrated from the north or from the Levant in the distant past. This belief is genuine. It is articulated by Igbo elders and by community historians and by congregations with conviction. It informs communal identity and liturgy and practice for those who hold it, and it has been explored in works by Igbo writers and thinkers who locate it within a broader narrative of belonging and moral orientation in a world shaped by both Christianity and indigenous Igbo spirituality. It should be described with the same respect that we accord to any community's understanding of its own sacred history, and it is part of the authentic religious and cultural identity of a segment of the Igbo people today. At the same time, intellectual honesty requires us to distinguish clearly between cultural and religious identity, which operates in the domain of meaning and belonging and faith, and the conclusions of modern population genetics, which operates in the domain of empirical, testable hypotheses about allele frequencies, about mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages, and about patterns of relatedness over many millennia. When that genetic evidence has been examined by academic research teams, including teams that include Nigerian scientists working in Nigerian universities and laboratories, the data have not provided scientific support for a direct and large-scale Israelite origin for the Igbo as a population. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial lineages found in Igbo land are overwhelmingly characteristic of West African populations with deep roots in the region, as we would expect from the archaeology and linguistics of the area, and the specific genetic signatures that population genetics would predict if there had been a major migration from the Levant in the historical period associated with the 12 tribes of Israel have not been identified at the population level. Nigerian researchers themselves have repeatedly pointed this out in peer-reviewed publications and in public discussion, noting that while the cultural tradition remains significant and worthy of study on its own terms as a phenomenon of identity and faith, there is currently insufficient genetic evidence to sustain it as a scientific account of population origins. To state this is not to dismiss the tradition or to question the sincerity or the good faith of those who cherish it. It is to maintain the important boundary that allows both cultural history and population genetics to be taken seriously on their own grounds, without confusing the evidentiary standards of one for those of the other, and without allowing a genetic result to be used to delegitimize a community's self-understanding or a cultural tradition to be used to override the empirical limits of genetic data. When we put all of these strands together, from the Clark's ledgers along the James River to the ridges of sweet potato mounds that echoed the yam mounds of home, from the low voice of the Igbo drum heard at night in a tidewater quarter to the anxious letters in which Virginia masters complained about the stubbornness of the Igbo people they could not break, from the desperate and dignified act at Dunbar Creek in May of 1803 to the generation after generation of Gullah Geechee storytellers who said that their ancestors did not die but flew, and from that marsh to the quiet arrival of an email telling you that your own DNA estimate has been updated from 28 to 35% Nigerian, what emerges is not a single sensational statistic or a secret that was hidden and now is revealed once and for all, but a far richer and more enduring and more human picture. It is a picture of a people, the Igbo, who were carried to the Chesapeake in such numbers and at such a concentrated moment that their language and their farming knowledge and their music became part of the texture of early African American life in the Upper South, whose presence was so constant that it entered the vocabulary of the plantation, and so resilient that even the deliberate erasure of names and villages could not erase it entirely, and whose descendants, through the ordinary and extraordinary processes of generations and of forced movement south and west, and then north during the Great Migration, became part of the ancestry of a very large number of Black Americans today, not as an abstract percentage, but as grandmothers and grandfathers whose names were taken from them, but whose words for food and whose ways of growing it, and whose determination to define freedom on their own terms have persisted in ways we can still hear and taste and name. It is a history that can be counted up to a point, and it is also a history that must be listened to, because the numbers and the stories need one another to be true. So I want to leave you with a question, because this history contains many different kinds of evidence and different people will be drawn to different parts of it, and I am genuinely curious which piece stayed with you after hearing the full sweep. Which number hit you the most? Which fact are you still turning over in your mind? Was it number 1, the archival reality that in the peak decades between 1700 and 1740 30 to 45% of Africans arriving in Virginia came from the Bight of Biafra, with as many as 80 to 90% of those being identified as Igbo? Was it number 2, the way Douglas Chambers uses the term Igboization to describe the Tidewater Chesapeake, and the honest scholarly debate with researchers like David Eltis about how far that demographic projection can be extended when the trade to the rest of the mainland is taken into account? Was it number 3, the survival of the word okra from the Igbo okuru, carried across the Atlantic with seeds themselves and preserved in American English for 3 centuries? Was it number 4, the transfer of the Igbo yam complex onto the sweet potato in Virginia provision grounds, and the preservation of that memory in the continued use of the word yam? Was it number 5, the material and social evidence for the Igbo drum and the planter stereotype of Igbo melancholy and recalcitrance as an indirect archive of cultural persistence? Or was it number 6, the story of Igbo Landing at Dunbar Creek in May 1803, and the Gullah Geechee tradition of the flying Africans that has kept that memory alive for more than 200 years and given it a name on the landscape itself? Let me know in the comments which number you are choosing, 1 through 6, and tell us why that particular piece of the story mattered most to you. If you are trying to make sense of your own commercial DNA results while you hold this larger history in mind, we put together a resource that may help you read them with more confidence and more caution at the same time. It is a 24-page guide to decoding your DNA test results that explains in plain language what your ethnicity percentages actually mean, what your maternal and paternal haplogroups can and cannot tell you about a single line of ancestors, why full siblings can receive different ethnicity estimates, and what the real limits of at-home tests are, including an honest explanation of why African ethnic percentages in particular are so unstable between database updates and why that shift does not mean the test was wrong. You will find the link in the description, Silk of Opisani, if you want to download it. And next time on Genome Trails, we will stay on the coast, where the memory of Igbo Landing has been carefully preserved, and trace the broader story of how the Gullah Geechee built and sustained a culture that kept more of Africa alive in America than anywhere else, from the cadence of their language and the coil of their sweetgrass baskets, to the spiritual traditions that still carry the echo of those first crossings, and the determination to remain a distinct people. If we look more closely at those Virginia ledgers year by year, the pattern sharpens rather than fades, because the concentration of Bight of Biafra arrivals is not an artifact of a single unusually large vessel, but a sustained structure of commerce that held for more than a generation. Between 1700 and 1740, in the surviving naval office lists for the York River, the Rappahannock and the Upper James, the proportion of captives whose African coast of purchase is recorded as Biafra moves within that 30 to 45% band with remarkable consistency, rising in some years above 50% when a cluster of Bristol and Liverpool vessels, arriving in the late summer and early autumn, the season when tobacco planters were most eager to buy labor before the winter, had all cleared the Bonny and Calabar rivers within weeks of one another. The vessels themselves were on average smaller than the large South Carolina slavers of the later 18th century, often carrying between 80 and 150 captives rather than 300 or 400, which mattered for how people experienced the crossing. because a smaller vessel meant fewer language groups on board and a higher chance that a majority shared the same inland market system. The age and sex composition recorded for these cargoes also tells us something about who was being taken. The Bight of Biafra cargoes landed in Virginia show a relatively balanced sex ratio compared with the heavily male cargoes taken to the Sugar Islands, with women and girls comprising roughly a third to as much as 40% on many voyages, and a notable proportion of children and adolescents, which reflects the inland mechanisms of enslavement in the Igbo hinterland, where debt pawnship and judicial sanctions and kidnapping swept up whole households rather than just young men captured in warfare, and which had profound consequences for cultural transmission, because women and children are central to the reproduction of language and foodways and spiritual knowledge. That the traders themselves recognized this homogeneity is visible in how they marketed the captives on arrival. Advertisements for sales at Yorktown and at Hobbs Hole do not simply list numbers, they list places of purchase in Africa as a shorthand for what the planter could expect, and the terms New Calabar and Bonnie appear in those sale notices as brands that the buyers had learned to read, with Bonnie in particular associated in the 1720s with a steady supply of what Virginians called Igbo. Why that supply was so consistently identified as Igbo in that specific window requires a brief detour into the interior economy that fed the ports. In the decades around 1700, Old Calabar, dominated by Efik merchant houses such as those that would later become the Henshaw and Duke families, drew captives down the Cross River system, while Bonnie, situated at the easternmost outlet of the Niger Delta, drew increasingly on the vast network controlled by Aro merchants, whose oracle at Arachukwu served as a judicial and religious authority across much of Igboland. The Aro network operated through a system of fairs and markets that stretched northward toward the Igbo heartland towns of the Awka and Isu and Agbaja regions, and the decisions made at those markets, whether a debt had become unpayable, whether an oracle had declared a person guilty of an abomination, whether a kidnapping raid organized by a local strongman had delivered captives for sale, all fed a stream of people who spoke dialects of Igbo toward the coast. European traders rarely ventured inland themselves. They waited at the coastal towns and recorded what their African intermediaries told them about the origins of the people they were purchasing. And because those intermediaries were selling a population that was in that era predominantly Igbo, the English label Igbo became a working category that, while not capturing the full dialectal and village diversity within Igboland, did correspond to a real linguistic and cultural community rather than a fictional European invention. Later in the century, that correspondence would become looser as the Bight of Biafra trade expanded to include more Ibibio, Efik, and cross-river peoples. But for the Chesapeake's critical early period, the correlation between embarkation in the Bight of Biafra and Igbo identity is at its strongest, which is why historians who work with the Virginia material treat the Biafran share as a reasonable proxy for the Igbo share, while always acknowledging the margin of uncertainty. That margin of uncertainty is precisely what we must keep in view when we translate shipping shares into claims about ancestry, and it is where the careful voice of the scholarship becomes most audible. When Douglas Chambers writes about Igboization, he is drawing on two kinds of evidence that reinforce one another, but that also have different limits. The first is the quantitative evidence of the shipping lists and the transatlantic slave trade database, which is strong on proportions and on timing, and which can be cross-checked against the Liverpool and Bristol port books that record the outfitting and return of the same vessels. The second is the qualitative evidence of the Virginia Gazette runaway advertisements, of plantation journals and letters, and of material culture, which is strong on lived experience, but impressionistic in a statistical sense. A runaway advertisement that describes a man as an Igbo who speaks very good English and plays the drum is a precious data point, but it is also a document written by a master trying to recover property, applying an ethnic label according to his own folk taxonomy, sometimes based on scarification, sometimes based on what the African had told him, sometimes based on what the trader who sold him had claimed. Over hundreds of such advertisements, a pattern emerges, yet no single advertisement can be treated as an ethnographic certificate. David Eltis and other scholars who have worked at the scale of the entire Atlantic have emphasized this problem of labeling and have also emphasized scale. When the whole of the forced migration to mainland North America is considered, which includes the very large importations into South Carolina between 1740 and 1807, many of whom came from Angola and from the Bight of Benin, and the later direct importations into Georgia, the overall share of Biafrans in the total imported population of what became the United States is lower than its share in Virginia alone, which means that any estimate of widespread Igbo ancestry for the entire African American population must rest not only on the Virginia concentration, but also on the argument that Virginia's population, because it grew by natural increase earlier and faster than the rice colonies, and because so many Virginians were later forcibly moved south and west during the domestic slave trade after 1808, contributed disproportionately to the genealogical ancestry of later generations. That argument is plausible, and it is supported by demographic studies of the domestic slave trade. But it also requires assumptions about family formation under slavery, about how often people from different regional African backgrounds intermarried in the 19th century, and about how genealogical diffusion works over 10 to 12 generations, where a single ancestor in 1720 can appear in thousands of descendant pedigrees, or through lines that die out, in none. The honest scholarly position, and the one that both Chambers and Eltis in their different ways model, is to present these as reasoned inferences based on the best available data rather than as settled facts, and to invite the listener to understand why the Igbo presence in the Chesapeake is historically certain, while the exact proportion of contemporary Black Americans who carry an Igbo ancestor remains an estimate that is debated and that is inherently difficult to verify at the level of the individual family, not least because the domestic slave trade of the 19th century, which moved more than 1 million people from the Upper South to the Lower South, deliberately destroyed the documentary trace of those families, and because courthouse fires, the lack of surname continuity, and the simple fact that enslaved marriages were not recorded in state archives mean that most lineages encounter a wall of silence 2 or 3 generations after arrival. That silence makes the cultural traces that do survive all the more important to describe accurately, without exaggeration and without minimizing. The word okra is the clearest linguistic survival, but its history repays a closer look. The English word is first attested in Virginia sources in the first decade of the 18th century, and its form matches the Igbo okuru or okwuru far more closely than it matches the Twi or Akan names for the same plant, which suggests that the pathway of transmission was not a generic West African borrowing, but a specific one mediated by Igbo speakers. The plant itself, Abelmoschus esculentus, is not native to Virginia. It requires a long, hot summer, and its successful cultivation in the tidewater depended on the tacit knowledge of people who had grown it before. Knowledge about spacing, about harvesting the young pods before they became fibrous, about parching the seeds for later planting. That knowledge traveled with the people, often without any written instruction, and it entered the provision economy that sustained enslaved communities. Plantation accounts that list rations issued by the master rarely mention okra at all, because it was not part of the official ration, yet it appears in descriptions of what people grew for themselves and in the recipes that descendants would later teach to Federal Writers Project interviewers in the 1930s, where okra soup thickened with the plant's mucilage is described as a dish that had always been made, a phrase that signals intergenerational transmission. The yam to sweet potato translation is even more revealing when set in its agricultural context. In Igboland, the white yam is grown on large mounds that can be 1 meter high, built by hand with hoes, and the vines are trained up stakes to maximize tuber size, while the tubers are harvested and then stored in ventilated barns that allow them to be kept for months. Virginia's soils and climate could not replicate that system at the scale of a plantation provision operation, but the logic of the system, the mounding, the careful attention to soil aeration, the curing and storage of a starchy staple that could carry a household through winter, was transferred intact to the sweet potato. The sweet potato, which is a New World crop that had been introduced to West Africa by the Portuguese and was thus already familiar to some Igbo farmers, proved to be agronomically forgiving in tidewater soils, and the enslaved farmers of the tidewater built for it the same kinds of ridges and winding hillocks that they had built for yams, using the same hoes and the same collective labor at planting and harvest. The linguistic outcome, calling the sweet potato a yam, is therefore not a simple confusion. It is a preservation of a category of cultural value, a way of saying this new root fills the same place in our life that the old root filled, and that preservation was meaningful enough that it survived emancipation and migration, and appears today in markets across the South where sweet potatoes are still labeled yams. The Igbo drum, while less widely known than okra, is attested in a small but consistent set of observations that become convincing when placed together. 18th century descriptions of music in the Chesapeake quarters mention a small drum that could be carried and played while walking, distinct from the larger barrel drums that would become associated with Congo Square in New Orleans, and that is described as being of the Igbo type or as being beaten in the Igbo manner. That organological detail matters because drum construction is culturally specific. The diameter of the head, the method of lacing, the use of a single skin rather than two, the playing technique with hands versus sticks, all encode a tradition of making that is learned in apprenticeship rather than invented anew, and the presence of a drum identified by contemporaries as Igbo in Virginia in the 1730s and 1740s is therefore a material trace of Igbo craft. Alongside it, the planter complaint archive that we glimpsed earlier becomes more legible. In the correspondence of men like William Byrd of Westover, and in the journals of travelers who toured the Tidewater, the description of Igbo captives as melancholy and prone to suicide recurs with a frequency that exceeds the description of any other group, and it is linked explicitly to a belief that they would rather die than be held. Modern scholarship reads that stereotype not as evidence of a cultural predisposition, but as evidence of a specific historical experience of alienation and resistance. Because Igbo cosmology placed heavy emphasis on the relationship between personal destiny and the earth, and on the possibility of returning to the homeland spiritually after death, ideas that planters encountered as incomprehensible obstinacy when they found that certain captives would not eat, or would not respond to punishment, or would attempt to take their own lives. That the same stereotype also contains an acknowledgement of rebelliousness. That Igbo slaves are described as more likely to fight overseers or to attempt escape in groups, completes the picture of a community that retained a collective sense of self and a refusal to naturalize enslavement, a refusal that would have been visible to the planters who tried to manage them, and that would have been transmitted within the enslaved community as knowledge about who could be trusted in a plan. That knowledge is what carries us to Dunbar Creek, where the convergence of rebellion and cosmology must be told with both precision and humility. The year 1803 is not an arbitrary date. It falls in the narrow window between the reopening of the Georgia slave trade in 1803, after the state's earlier attempt to close it, and the federal closure of the transatlantic trade in 1808, a window in which a surge of vessels from the Bight of Biafra cleared the Georgia coast as traders anticipated prohibition. The schooner that arrived off St. Simon's Island that May was a coastal vessel engaged in that final intensification, carrying captives who had been purchased at Bonny or Calabar within the previous months, and who had survived the Middle Passage to Charleston or Savannah before being resold coastwise, a common pattern for Georgia in that era. Cooper and Spaulding, the purchasers, were not marginal figures, but established planters who would later become prominent proponents of scientific agriculture and of the management of enslaved labor, and their decision to buy a group of Igbo captives together and to hold them together for sale meant that the captives retained the social cohesion that made collective action possible. The marsh geography of Dunbar Creek, a tidal creek that at low water exposes extensive mudflats and at high water is deep enough to float a small schooner, shaped what happened next, because the captives, once they had overpowered the crew in the struggle that every version of the tradition records, found themselves on a narrow strip of land between creek and forest, with pursuit inevitable and with no prospect of reaching the interior without being captured. The decision to enter the war together, led by a figure remembered as a chief, must be understood in the context of Igbo beliefs about water as a boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirit, and about suicide not as an end but as a return, beliefs that planters recorded with bewilderment when they noted that Igbo people spoke of going home to their country after death. That the number who died is variously reported is consistent with an event where the dead were not counted by any neutral authority, and where the bodies, left in tidal water, were not recovered for burial in a marked cemetery, but that the place was immediately named and that the name survived in white deed records as well as in black oral tradition is the best evidence that the community and the planters alike understood that something out of the ordinary had occurred. The oral tradition that became the Flying Africans narrative did not appear suddenly as an invention. It grew in the way living traditions grow, through the repetition and elaboration that occurs when a story is told to children to teach a lesson and to adults to offer consolation. When Gullah Geechee elders on Sapelo and St. Simon's told the story in the early 20th century to the researchers who came with wax cylinders and notebooks, they told it not as a news report but as a parable of power, saying that the Igbo people knew a song or a word that the white man did not know, that they turned and walked on the water and rose, that some turned into buzzards and flew, details that link the narrative to West African understandings of spiritual transformation and to the everyday observation of buzzards rising on thermals over the marsh, a natural image that becomes a metaphor for the soul's ascent, that the story was told with variations, that one narrator would emphasize the singing, another the water, another the flight itself, is not a flaw in the archive. It is the nature of oral history which preserves the core event and its meaning while allowing the peripheral details to shift with the teller and the audience. What remained stable across all tellings was the moral, that the captives had chosen to return to Africa on their own terms rather than live as slaves, and that their choice was not defeat but victory, which is why the story was told and retold long after slavery ended, and why it was invoked during the civil rights movement and afterward as an image of collective resistance. The small park at Igbo Landing today, with its historical marker erected after sustained advocacy by Gullah Geechee community historians, does not attempt to provide a forensic reconstruction of the day. It marks the place where memory has been kept, and the annual gatherings held there, where participants pour libation and call names, are a continuation of that keeping. That keeping is now joined by a different kind of keeping, the keeping of information in DNA, and the two forms of memory must be brought into conversation without allowing one to displace the other. When a descendant today receives a commercial ancestry report that says 26% Nigerian, that number is best understood as a statistical portrait of similarity rather than a genealogical certificate of tribal membership. The companies build their reference panels by sampling people who live today in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Cameroon, and elsewhere, and who report that their grandparents were all from the same community, and they then use machine learning models to divide the genome into segments and to assign each segment to the reference population it most resembles, with a confidence score that is often rendered as a percentage. Because the reference panels for West Africa are still less dense than those for Europe, and because the genetic differences between neighboring West African communities are relatively small compared with the differences between continents, the assignment of a particular segment to Nigerian rather than to Benin and Togo or to Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu is inherently probabilistic, which is why the companies also report broader categories, like broadly West African, that are more stable across updates. When Ancestry DNA released its major update in 2018 and again in 2022, many African American testers watched their Nigerian percentages swing by 10 points or more overnight without any change in their actual DNA. An experience that was confusing and for some distressing until they understood that the swing reflected a change in the company's algorithm and in the composition of its Nigerian reference panel, which had been expanded with additional samples from southeastern Nigeria, and which had been subdivided to distinguish more finely between coastal and inland ancestry. 23andMe has undergone similar recalibrations, moving from a coarse West African category to a more granular Nigerian category, and then refining that category again as its database grew. That refinement is a sign of scientific improvement rather than error, but it means that any attempt to read a precise Igbo percentage off a commercial test must be approached with caution, and that the most responsible use of the test is to treat the broad West African and specifically southeastern Nigerian components as indicative of regional ancestry, while recognizing that the label Igbo itself is a cultural and linguistic identity that genetics can point toward but cannot by itself confer, because ethnicity is lived in language and kinship, and not only in allele frequencies. At the population level, the most robust picture of African American genomic ancestry comes not from any single commercial report, but from academic studies that have aggregated thousands of genomes and that have used methods that combine autosomal, mitochondrial, and Y chromosome data with historical records. Those studies consistently find that on average, African Americans carry about 70 to 75% African ancestry and about 20 to 24% European ancestry, with the remainder typically a very small fraction of Native American ancestry, often below 1% on average, though the distribution is wide. In one large study of more than 5,000 African Americans from different regions, the median African ancestry was 73%. The median European ancestry was 24%, and the range for African ancestry stretched from below 50% to above 95%, which underscores how misleading any single average is for an individual. The mitochondrial DNA, which traces the direct maternal line, tells a different story again, because more than 90% of African American mitochondrial lineages are of African origin, reflecting the history of enslaved women whose maternal lines persisted even as European male ancestry entered the population through coercive unions. While the Y chromosome, which traces the direct paternal line, shows a higher proportion of European lineages, a genetic echo of the sexual violence of slavery that must be named plainly. Within the African component, the contributions from the Bight of Biafra and from West Central Africa are consistently among the largest, but they coexist with substantial contributions from the Bight of Benin, from the Gold Coast, and from Senegambia, and the relative proportions vary by region, with low-country African Americans often showing a slightly higher proportion of Senegambian and Sierra Leonean ancestry linked to the rice trade, and Upper South African Americans often showing a slightly higher proportion of Biafran ancestry linked to the early Virginia imports. That regional variation is not a contradiction of the Igbo contribution. It is the expected result of a trade that drew on different parts of Africa at different times for different colonies and then mixed those ancestries together through the forced internal migrations of the 19th century, which moved people from the Chesapeake to the cotton frontiers of Alabama and Mississippi and Texas, thereby spreading tidewater lineages far beyond the tidewater itself. In that mixed and mobile history, the Igbo cultural and religious self-understanding that traces ancestry through Eri and Gad must be given its due place. Among Igbo communities today, particularly among those who have joined syncretic Judaizing movements, the narrative that the Igbo are descended from the tribe of Gad through his son Eri is not a fringe curiosity, but a sincerely held account of origins that is taught, preached, and lived, and that is elaborated through genealogies that link village founders to biblical figures, through observances that mirror Jewish practice, and through pilgrimages and community education. Scholars of Igbo religion have documented how this tradition grew in the 20th century in conversation with Christian mission history and with the search for a dignified identity in a post-colonial context, and they stress that its significance lies less in whether it can be verified by archaeology and more in what it does for those who hold it, which is to provide a narrative of chosenness and continuity and moral purpose. To approach that tradition with respect, while also maintaining the distinction between cultural meaning and genetic evidence, is not a dismissal, it is a way of honoring both domains. Population genetics, which works with the frequencies of mitochondrial haplogroups like L1, L2, and L3 that are common across West Africa, and with Y chromosome haplogroups like E1B1A that similarly reflect deep West African roots, has not found the pattern that would be expected if a large-scale migration from the Levant had established the Igbo population in the historical period associated with the Israelite tribes, and Nigerian geneticists themselves have been explicit on this point, noting that the available data point to continuity with other West African populations rather than to a recent Levantine origin, a conclusion that has been reached not to delegitimize Igbo identity, but to describe what the genetic data currently show, with the openness that all scientific conclusions are revisable in light of new evidence, but that revisability requires evidence rather than assertion. What remains when the ledgers and the stories and the laboratory reports are placed side by side is a history that is neither hidden nor sensational, but that has been overlooked in many popular accounts precisely because it requires holding together methods that are usually kept apart. Archival counting and cultural listening and genetic estimation, each with its own standards of proof and its own kind of eloquence. The Igbo were not the only Africans brought to early America, but in the Tidewater Chesapeake, in the decades when the foundations of African-American culture were being laid, they were the most numerous. And the consequences of that numerical weight are traceable in the words we still use for food, and in the crops we still call by a name that remembers yams, in the construction of a small drum that was once described as abo, in the anxious stereotype of a people who would not be made docile, and in the enduring memory of a group of captives who at Dunbar Creek chose the water and who have been remembered ever since as people who flew. That the estimate that as many as 60% of Black Americans may have an Igbo ancestor is presented as an estimate debated among historians, rather than a certainty, does not weaken the claim to significance. It strengthens it, because it shows how a population history can be substantial without being overstated, and how honesty about the limits of the archive is part of honoring the people the archive tried to erase. That commercial DNA percentages are unstable does not make them meaningless. It makes them what they are, estimates of similarity that are improving as reference panels grow, but that will always be more reliable at the level of region than at the level of ethnicity, and that must be interpreted alongside family history and historical geography, rather than as a replacement for them. And that a community's religious narrative about descent from Erie and Gad is not supported by current genetic data does not make that narrative inauthentic. It makes it a different kind of truth, the truth of identity and faith, which deserves respect on its own terms, while science continues to describe patterns of ancestry in its own idiom.